So, everyone, today is really about transformation. And many of you know some of the history of the OpenChain project, but maybe not all. And many of you know some of the things we're doing now, but maybe not all of the strategy behind it. So in this talk, I'm going to try and give a picture of that, an understanding of that, and explain, I guess, the bigger picture of what we're doing and why. So the first thing to highlight is that the current group of people in the OpenChain Governing Board, the companies they represent, is a very big and diverse mix. As you can see from this slide, we have a remarkable collection of companies sitting on our governing board, and including, of course, Moxa from Taiwan. These companies are from many different industries and are of very different sizes. In total, they represent almost 6 trillion US dollars in market value. This means, of course, that their influence is very large. And it's one of the reasons that the OpenChain project has been able to work on standards that really matter for the supply chain. But the true success of the OpenChain project is much larger than those companies. It's the community, it's you. And with our very large groups in geographies like Taiwan, on special topics like automotive or telco, we're covering a huge amount of the ground important for thinking about more trustable, more efficient supply chains. We're most famous for open source license compliance, but we also do a lot of work on similar topics. And that's really what I'm going to be talking about today. With the success of our early days around open source license compliance, we began touching more and more industry verticals. This slide is just examples of the type of industry verticals and the type of companies we're touching. The examples here are our board members and some of the larger companies that announced they use our license compliance standard. But our community, again, is so much bigger than that. On this slide, from just a couple of our mailing lists, you'll see companies involved in our local geographic meetings. You'll see companies involved in helping us build future standards and all types of other things. Lockheed Martin is in the center because they're helping us work on security standardization right now. Not a governing board member, and not a company that has formally announced using our compliance standard, but a community leader in developing the standards and building the future. So this massive community, over 1,000 companies, are working on a better supply chain. So in the fundamental, a lot of these companies are working on a better supply chain and doing a lot of things. And the question is, why? The big picture is always important, I think. If you see activities not tied together, it can be really hard to understand the value proposition, and it can be very hard to understand the logic. Now, for us, the logic is actually pretty simple. The value proposition is simple. It's a straight path from the very first day we launched until today. But I want to explain this path so that you can understand more clearly the consequences of where we are today and where we're going next. So in 2016, the OpenChain project decided to create more trust in the supply chain by fixing one of the largest challenges, one of the biggest problems we had with open source. Our challenge, our problem, was that a lot of open source was being used without proper licensing information. And on my slide, I say that created a huge legal risk. In some ways, that is an understatement. It created a situation where, under law, people were not allowed to distribute the open source they were distributing. The implications of that for a supply chain, for trust in the supply chain, for being comfortable with suppliers, for being safe in procurement, was huge. And while people often would say, oh, we don't see many large lawsuits about this, that doesn't mean that the risk isn't there. And as open source gets more and more valuable, the risk increases and increases and increases. Sometimes people would say, well, isn't the risk really that some individual developer will get angry? No, not at all, not in the modern age. A long time ago, in open source, it was mostly individuals creating it. But nowadays, when you look at something like the Linux kernel, over 80% of the code is corporate code. You're using code from companies like Intel. We're seeing code from companies like Samsung or Google. That's the majority of the code in very big projects. And that's the enormous legal risk of playing with other people's intellectual property without the correct permission. So we identified that as the biggest challenge to a trusted supply chain in 2016. And we thought really long and hard about how do we create a solution to that challenge, a solution that is suitable for everyone. Small companies, big companies, companies with money to get people to work on stuff, and companies without money who really struggle to do things like open source compliance because they don't have people free to apply to this. They don't have extra money to put on this. So we actually thought about it a lot, and we decided to create a very high-level process standard that's very simple, but somehow works for all types of companies. And we decided that this standard should be open source, basically. We should develop it with an open source style community. We should make sure that that community was not just the founding companies, not just the governing board, but really any company that was interested could come inside, not only use the standard, but help create the standard. So to address open source, we took an open source style community approach, and we built a de facto industry standard in 2016. De facto means industry created, but not from a standardization body. So it means we've decided to build it and use it as an agreement between us. And the next step is to go to a standardization body and have it turn into a formal official standard from that body. And we decided to do that through ISO. So we got our compliance standard and we submitted it to ISO in 2019. So we went from 2016, writing it and releasing it. And then we spent 3 years getting feedback and improving it, and then feeling confident we've done the right thing for the supply chain. We went to ISO. And ISO very quickly did a conversion process of a de facto standard into a formal ISO standard, and we got ISO 5230. So this is how we started, and this is why we started. Now, I know you know this, but this will come back as an important part of the story. With an ISO standard for license compliance, designed especially for procurement, we really were interested in companies asking other companies to use this as part of the trust in the supply chain. Within 1 year, we saw a lot more companies using it. That's wonderful. But we saw them also using it for reasons we didn't really expect. For example, our compliance standard is used a lot in M&A negotiations, merger and acquisition. In some ways, that's extremely predictable. People want to check, is the open source license compliance okay? Is the company I'm about to buy full of dangerous intellectual property surprises or not? But it was also being used in other parts of M&A, like pricing discussions. That's totally fine. It was just an interesting data point for us. The more interesting thing, though, was that people started using our license compliance standard for security. And just 1 year into being an ISO standard, as our community of conformant organizations increased, we got more and more reports of this security use. Now, we were interested in this for a very simple reason. Our standard covers most of the same processes for security. So our license compliance standard covers most of the things you need to do in security around open source, but it was not designed for security. And that means it was not a perfect fit, not 100% good fit. We are an open project. So when people started to use it for security, when people took a license compliance standard and used it, we started to think about, okay, how do we respond to that? How do we help them? So we weren't thinking about saying, no, don't do this. We weren't thinking about saying it's way out of scope. Instead, we thought, okay, so people are taking it and using it for open source security because they need it. And we created a guide about how to use our license compliance standard for security. How to do that, basically saying these parts of the standard are useful for security. The other parts are license compliance only. And at the same time as releasing that guide, I will use a term here, imperfect fit. Useful, yes. Responding to what people are doing, yes. Perfect solution, no. We talked about whether we make a new standard for security. What if we made a perfect solution? What if we made a standard for security? Now, talking about making a new standard is actually a much bigger strategic discussion than just writing something. We know how to write standards. We can have a meeting and write a standard, but that's not strategic at all. We had to think about transforming from maintaining the ISO standard for open source license compliance, our original decision, into making a family of standards. And that's a strategic step. It's larger than it sounds. A family of standards should not just be documents existing in the same organization. They should somehow interact. They should flow from one to another. If you use one, it should be easy to use the other. And thinking about license compliance, people were already using it for security. Clearly, we could make a sister standard. And if you use the compliance standard, relatively easily, you could use the security standard. Or if you use the security standard, relatively easily, you could go to the compliance standard. But how to build the family? That means you need approaches and processes, etc. Now, for us, we were actually quite lucky. I said that our vision was a trusted supply chain. We were never inherently limited to licensing. We always had a bigger vision. We want to build trust. We choose to start with license compliance. And when we started with license compliance, we didn't just write a standard. We made formal processes for how to write it and in future how to edit it. And that vision and those processes were perfectly compatible with making a security standard. From the very beginning, the way we approached this was high level. We said have some inbound processes, have internal process policy and training, and have some outbound processes. That approach works for license compliance, it works for security, and it can work for other things too, because those processes are about predictable supply chain, company by company. So we were fortunate that basically we had the foundation for doing this, and we just had to get started keeping a strategic picture, thinking we're making a family now, so we're making a sister standard. And because we were doing that, clearly thinking interrelated, not reinventing, making a sister standard, we forked the license compliance standard to make the security standard. And we were able to write the first generation really quickly. That meant we could very quickly submit it to ISO. We could say to ISO, here's a security standard, but it's a sister standard of the license compliance standard. And if you compare them, you'll immediately see the family connection. So it went quickly into ISO, and then they very quickly voted on it. And they voted yes. So our security standard went through ISO faster than our license compliance standard. They very clearly understood building a family, they saw the connections, they saw the logic. So actually, we're in the middle of the publication process at ISO. You can expect ISO 18974. Well, I said the next couple of weeks on my slide, I don't know, whenever they hit publish. The only thing that is making it slow is the fact it's August and that's holiday time in Europe and they're based in Geneva. Right now you can get us on the website as ISO PRF, so that means it's pending publication, and you can get it on our website as well. Naturally, the version on our website is free to download. Everything we do is free. We're designed to help people get started. So amazingly then, we went from solving license compliance and having a lot of success into finding people wanted to do other similar stuff, finding that we were well positioned to do that, and executing, and now having a second ISO standard. That's exciting, and it has implications beyond today, where we have ISO standard for license compliance, we have an ISO standard for security past the vote, just waiting for the formal document to be published. There's bigger implications even from that. You see, now we have done something remarkable. We have transformed from a project focused on process management around open source license compliance. We've transformed into a more general project focused on critical open source process management. So we've transformed from license compliance into more broadly saying we work on critical open source process management. We are a project that builds trust in the supply chain by finding critical process things that people need, that people want, and working on it. So we've actually already started work on a new standard that may become an ISO standard next year, a contribution standard. At the very end of our license compliance standard, there's a little section saying, if you are going to contribute to open source projects, have a policy for that. And obviously that policy can say, we contribute and here's how, or it can say we don't contribute and here's how we don't. Both decisions are valid. But in our license compliance standard, we only mentioned it, saying do something here. And people said to us, you know, it would be really useful to have some more process description around contribution approaches, because you need a policy, you need processes, you have decisions about how to do this. How do you submit the company copyright into someone else's project? What can be acceptable, etc., etc., etc. So people said, we want more process descriptions around contribution. And we want them to be like license compliance or like security. We want them to be neutral, not opinionated, just helping with the basic processes so companies can see. And a lot of companies are deciding, for example, they want to contribute and trying to brainstorm on their own, specifically what processes do I need? So we're bringing the brainstorming together and we're discussing how will a contribution standard potentially look. Discussion is happening now. After a few months, we'll take the result of the discussion, a draft standard, and we'll take it to our governing board and our steering committee, and they'll analyze it and decide, yes, this will be the third member of the family, or no, it won't. And if they decide, yes, it is, we release it, and we also then take it through ISO. So yeah, OpenChain now is familiar to you, and it's got the license standard you know about, it's got the security standard you probably know about, but OpenChain is now building a family. And we're building a family for the same reason we always had, trusted supply chain. We're building it with the same approach we always had, which is high-level process standards, not opinionated. We don't tell people how to do things. We tell them what. Have a process here. Have a policy. Your specific process, your specific policy, that's your decision. But here and here and here is important because here and here and here is where problems happen. So we're not opinionated, but we are giving people the tools, the basic strategic tool to get a more trusted supply chain. We're giving them the strategic tool for license compliance, we're giving them the strategic tool for security assurance, and maybe we'll give them the strategic tool for contribution soon. Same mission, same vision, bigger scope. General critical open source process management across every industry vertical. And that means that the OpenChain family, going into something like a procurement contract, has a very significant potential to change even more of the global supply chain, and to change it with a simple mission to make it actually easier and cheaper to trust your supplier. It actually easier and cheaper to deal with your customer company, to make it actually a more comfortable supply chain, because we start to interlink people with the same approaches. It's a really cool time, and it will have implications for Taiwan, a lot. A lot of your customer companies are going to be using our standards, plural, over time. So it's important to understand them, it's important to be ready, it's important to be using them. And what I would love for this meeting to do, and future meetings, is to help you use the standards really easily without spending much time or money on it. I want this community to be the community you can rely on in Taiwan and internationally to help you do this stuff, to help you get a more efficient supply chain that has better licensing, better security, maybe quicker, easier, more reliable processes around stuff like contribution. And I'm very glad to say our project is designed for this. It has evolved into this, and we know what we're doing. We've got great relationships with ISO, with multinationals and governments, and it's all targeted to try to make open source work better between organizations in complex supply chains. Thank you for your time, and back to the room for a busy schedule.
Thank you, Shen, for your 真的转不过去。Thank you, Shen, for your fantastic sharing from one standard to a family. Really appreciate for your speech, especially I believe it's a public holiday in Japan.
Yep.
Thank you so much. And please say hi to your wife. And so sorry for, yeah.
Not at all. It's my pleasure. And I noticed that my colleague and friend from Toyota, Endo-san, is in Taiwan in the office.
Exactly.
So you can see we're all working hard because we want this community to be as wonderful as possible. And thank you for hosting this. And, you and singing have been doing such a wonderful job in bringing our community together. It's really inspirational. So I deeply appreciate it.
It's our pleasure. Thank you, Shane. So next topic will be singing.
Take care.